And it is my pleasure today to introduce Sangeeta Banerji, who's here at the Watson as one of our postdocs, started in the fall. And Sangeeta is, and we don't get many, so it's worth emphasizing, a geographer from Rutgers University, where she did her PhD. And today she's going to talk to us about her book project. I love the title, because Fixing Mumbai, someone who could fix Mumbai, that's going to be a hell of a story. And by way of introduction, I just want to say, Ashu and I, years ago, we had Manishankar Iyer here. And for those of you who don't know, Manishankar Iyer is a very prominent Congress politician, has been a minister at various times, was instrumental in the passage of the 72nd and 73rd constitutional amendments that decentralized and tried to give cities the power to govern themselves. And when he visited Brown, I remember we asked him a very simple question: how are Indian cities governed? And his response was, they are not, which isn't true. It's just they're not really governed in any way anyone's ever been able to really figure out. And this is why I love Sangeeta's work so much, because as you're going to discover today, Mumbai is definitely governed, but in ways that are sometimes difficult to grasp and with extraordinary complexity. So we're really looking forward to this talk. Sangeeta's going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions. So with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Sangeeta.
Okay. Before I begin, I would like to thank everyone present here, and a special note of thanks to Dr. Varshney, Stephanie, and Grace for organizing this talk for me. And thank you, Patrick, and everyone for being here and, for that generous introduction. Okay, so in this talk, I trace the processes and persons that undermine the technological and institutional reform initiatives designed for streamlining urban policy and property markets of Indian cities. This work is also the first institutional ethnography of the Brihan Mumbai Municipal Corporation, or as we know it, the BMC, the largest municipal bureaucracy in South Asia and perhaps the world. As I traverse the spaces of this labyrinthine institution, moving from its central offices to its remote outposts, I found fixers, brokers, middlemen operating from within the state space, making the bureaucracy visible to those who approached it. In most bureaucracies of the post-colonial state, irrespective of the function that they perform, one will invariably encounter fixers, brokers, and middlemen. Navigating these objective bureaucracies, without the assistance of these agents, one is sure to face insurmountable challenges: a lack of procedural clarity, apathy of the officers in charge, long waiting times, complicated and often unnecessary movement from desk to desk. Hiring an agent from the ranks of these fixers then becomes the default way to negotiate the bureaucracy. For a small fee, these morally ambiguous fixers can make things happen. Their specialization often involves knowing which officials get the job done quickly and with which necessary incentives, securing bridging divisions in the context of structural discontinuity, securing objects in place within a context of constant change and misplacement, and a cultivation of performance of a spatio-temporal awareness for tweaking the bureaucratic code in an unwieldy political milieu. The figure of the broker or fixer has been variously described in anthropological literature as a synapse, cultural translator, one who navigates inequality, a morally bankrupt individual who preys on the disadvantaged, or as someone merely furthering their own economic imperatives. The social anthropologist Deborah James, in exploring the complexity of brokerage in land markets of South Asia, notes how brokers are both the products and producers of a new kind of society, who embody the multiple roles of society, market, and the state. Much like the development studies literature emerging from the 70s and 80s, rural India by scholars such as James Manner, Stuart Coleridge, and Barbara Harris White, recent work in political science by Adam Orbach and Tariq Thachil have made interesting observations about the activities of political karyakartas or social workers in securing access to the state for the poor. However, this scholarship continues to view the acts of fixing as isolated, contextual actions of individuals instead of the systemic operation of brokerage that I aim to provide. Over a period of 15 months and 52 interviews across scales of the Bombay Municipal Corporation, and following a fixer known as the follow-up boy, I came to identify a range of positions that operate within the field of fixing. I explicate a field of fixing in which these actors, the fixers, operate in a hierarchical system of positions as a complex brokerage structure and constitute a distinct expression of state power in India. It is pervasive and operates alongside the bureaucracy, mirroring the system of positions within the bureaucratic field. I show that only through this field of fixing, which operates at all locations within the bureaucracy, can we begin to make sense of the ground reality and viability of the celebrated institutional reforms of the bureaucracy. What may seem like very localized and incongruent actions of touts and middlemen is on the ground a well-oiled machine, a machine that has been keeping the bureaucratic state in Indian cities functional. Though I dwell on the field of fixing in multiple scales of Mumbai's bureaucracy, I speculate that this field exists similarly in each and every sphere of the Indian state. To make this argument, I draw on Pierre Bourdieu's concept of the field, a distinct social space endowed with its own rules and regularities and forms of authority to explicate the play of power in society. My research synthesizes the rich literature on the everyday state in South Asia with a spatial analytical approach derived from within political geography and Bourdieusian field studies. Unlike the previous studies that characterize fixers, political brokers, and middlemen as individuals acting as shadows of the state that mimic, conceal, or elude bureaucratic rationality, I view the affinities between the field of fixing and the bureaucratic field as the necessary foundation for the emergence and endurance of the post-colonial state. Taking seriously the terrain of what Chatterjee has called the paralegal, a mediating domain of action between those who govern and those who are governed, I elucidate the field of fixing not as a source of corruption, but as a key resource through which political possibilities can be generated and sustained in a city plagued by intense inequality. Akhil Gupta, in his extensive work on the Indian bureaucracies, has claimed that corruption is not a dysfunctional aspect of state organization, but the very basis on which it comes to be constituted. The arbitrariness produced by large post-colonial bureaucracies with incomplete powers of governmental enumeration and statistics, he claims, leads to the structural exclusion of some individuals from state welfare services, even if they are entitled to them. This arbitrariness is experienced when subjects in the same structural position are met with completely different outcomes on approaching the bureaucracy, not due to the ill will or malice of presiding bureaucrats, but due to the violence inherent in these inscriptive technologies of the state. Modifying Gupta's argument in my research, I claim that in addition to the discursive and inscriptive devices constituting the state, fixers operating in close conjunction with the bureaucracy are crucial conduits through which the state comes to be materially perceived and experienced. While engaging with F.G. Bailey's research set within Odisha, Gupta himself has asked, was the broker who mediated between the government officials and the villagers and collected a small fee for his services a part of a corrupt system, or was he a legitimate facilitator akin to a lawyer who guided his client through the court system? Based on my ethnographic research, I can attest to the various roles that the fixers served inside and outside the bureaucracy. At different topographic scales and locations of the BMC, they manipulate state directives to ultimately manage the material consequences of interacting with the state. Thus, complicating Gupta's claim about the structural violence faced by the poor when interacting with the bureaucratic state in India, I posit that fixers employed by the poor and wealthy alike make visible a seemingly incoherent bureaucracy. However, I trace the actions of these fixers not in the block development offices of rural India, but in the corridors of the richest urban local body in India, the BMC. The BMC is a monstrous bureaucracy with tentacles that reach each and every corner of the megacity of Mumbai. with over 150,000 employees serving a population of approximately 13 million people, BMC is the largest urban bureaucracy in India and perhaps the world. Among the variety of functions that it serves in governing the life of an average Mumbaikar, the BMC also governs the use of every parcel of land in the city via a modernist instrument of spatial planning known as the development plan. Spatial planning directives contained in the DP are where differentiated access to the city is produced. The DP, sections of which can be seen over here, is not merely a symbolic or semiotic device of statecraft. This technocratic and modernist experiment in social engineering undergoes revision once in every 20 years and is also the site of intense political contestation over claims made on ownership and occupancy of land in Mumbai. As can be seen in the posters here, in the latest round of revisions, the architects of the DP opened it up for a participatory process, eliciting a vibrant civil society discourse on what previously was a highly technical process. However, the operation of the day-to-day activities of the DP is composed of a three-tiered institutional structure located at different scales of the city. As can be seen in the map here, the institutional structure of the DP department comprises of the centralized DP department in the fort area, then the building proposals or BP department in 4 different zones of the city, and the building and factory department within each administrative ward of the city, represented here by the letters in bold. For instance, this is the M East ward, the most impoverished area in the city with large informal settlements and also the focus of my research. While the DP department grants the permissions to develop land, the BP regulates the constructions of the buildings on the development permissions. And finally, the building and factory department monitors the adherence to the DP's bylaws. At first, I began by observing the everyday activities of mid and low-level bureaucrats within this institutional structure. First, at the head office, I spent time with tracers, technical staff who translate the dictate of the DP onto petitions seeking development permissions. Then at the zonal level, I spent time with sub-engineers granting approvals for various stages of the construction process. Finally, at the M East ward office, I followed junior engineers and mukadams, low-level bureaucrats as they went about their daily activities. I also spent time with the residents of Bhimnagar, an informal settlement within the M East ward, to probe their interactions with the fixers. In addition to this, in the period that the BMC was preparing for the World Bank assessment of doing business reforms of 2018, I served as the intern of the bureaucrat within the DP department, who I am calling Babu Rao in my research, working on implementing these reforms. One of my tasks was editing the script for press releases on these reforms by the bureaucracy. And to my surprise, these press notes were actually written by the real estate lobby group, Maharashtra Commerce and Housing Industries, instead of the bureaucracy themselves. During one of these editing sessions, while talking about these reforms, Mrs. K, one of the unofficial lobbyists, said, "If these reforms were real, it would become possible for just anyone to start a construction business in Mumbai." She was alluding to the fact that construction in Mumbai was considered one of the most arduous professions. Most professionals within the real estate sector would tell you that navigating the bureaucracy for building approvals was no mean feat and could only be achieved by a complex hierarchy of agents, often known as a trade secret. This observation leads me to ask, what was this hierarchy? How did it operate? And what was its encounter with the technological reforms? Home to the densest slum populations in Asia, Mumbai houses 52% of its population on 8% of its developable land. Yet, it is also home to one of the most highly capitalized real estate markets in the world, which is currently valued at about $800 billion, making up 43% of India's stock market value and 29% of its GDP. And while 52% of its population lives in dense informal settlements, 150,000 units of luxury housing of 3 or 4 or more bedrooms are lying vacant in the city. Scholars have estimated that while New York on an average, while in New York on an average income, it would take 47 years to purchase a 1,300 square foot house, in Mumbai, it would take 580 years. Ironically, these bizarre patterns of inequality have in part been produced by the development plan. Despite achieving an implementation rate of merely 12 to 14% since its inception in 1967, this instrument of social engineering has given rise to such a complex terrain of development control regulations or building bylaws that an entire host of specialists have emerged to deal with this regulatory regime. It does not help that even now, 55% of the developable land is owned merely by 9 private entities. Though there have been many attempts to remedy these cartels of land ownership and regulation, like the introduction of Urban Land Ceiling Act, and more recently stringent regulations with respect to slum redevelopment and real estate regulation, not much has changed in terms of the lived reality of the Mumbaikars, who now live in a landscape of violation defined by widespread non-conformance with land use regulations and building codes. Any file seeking permissions to develop a plot of land in the city must originate in the DP department, in which the institutional structure of which I laid out just now. It should move through approximately 32 offices. It should gain 117 clearances before the developer can break ground. This convoluted process might look like the rigmaroles of a bureaucracy to the rational Weberian onlooker, but in reality, this movement is full of snares and interruptions that cannot be imagined, much less planned for beforehand. The high revenues generated by this department is based on the development permissions that it grants to local real estate developers, has given it a prominent position in the urban bureaucracy. Though there has been significant discussion on urban planning and the failure of it in Mumbai, often directed towards the various neoliberal policies of this particular department, the DP department, there has been no engagement with the way in which this bureaucratic field related to the development of land actually operates. Due to the difficulty in accessing this exclusive space of the urban bureaucracy and the obfuscated building regulations, the scholarly discussion has remained restricted to the critique of grand plans and visions. In the next part of my presentation, I interrogate the ways in which this landscape of violation is reproduced in the city of Mumbai. By presenting an illustration of the field of fixing operating in the head offices and the local ward offices of the urban bureaucracy. To understand the routine movement of files within the bureaucracy, I located myself at the desk used by a low-level bureaucrat in the DP department known as the tracer. The routine, predictable, and calculable movement of paper within the bureaucracy is simply a platform upon which a secondary set of less traceable or predictable actions take place within the BMC. The tracer station is the critical site for routine file movements, but also where rumor, passion, and possibility frequently get concentrated and bubble up to the surface. This station is the site where state power finds its way onto the layout plans and becomes the future urban fabric of the city. The cubicle adjoining the tracer station, initially to me, looked like an unused vacant space left by the tracers. It was only after a few months of me regularly showing up to the bureaucracy, and after one of the tracers themselves pointed it out to me, that I noticed that there were always a few men sitting there, staring at their phones, or pretending to, talking in hushed tones. The cubicles had signs taped all around them, saying, "Please do not sit idle." And ironically, every time I was at the tracer station, I found at least 5 men, none of whom were employed by the bureaucracy, in this vacant space doing precisely that, sitting idle. I learned that this was the designated cubicle for the fixers, functioning as a waiting room cum office for these agents to prepare their papers, share thoughts, or wait for the relevant officer whose attention they sought to capture. It was at this space of the state within the bureaucracy that I first encountered the fixers and started tracing the field of fixing. Over time, and by repeatedly bothering these agents, I was able to establish a tenuous relationship with these fixers. Eventually, I started pushing each fixer that I met to introduce me to their superiors, and I was finally able to trace some sort of positions in this field. I learned after many months of hanging out at the tracer station that most of the fixers that operated within this field were either employed by particular real estate agents or real estate developers seeking permissions from the bureaucracy, or would work as freelance agents serving particular functions within this hierarchy. So they were like specialists in particular sectors. A senior fixer, during the initial months of my research, once asked me, "What kind of liaisoning do you want to study? BMC, Mantralaya, or central government? The local, state, or central government? Which industry?" He was pointing me towards the pervasive nature of the field of fixing and its influence beyond just the urban local state. At the behest of Khandekar, this senior fixer, his junior Suresh led me through the complex web of file movement that took place in the field of fixing and helped me develop a spatial analytical sensibility for discerning how these fixers work alongside the formal bureaucratic plane. Okay. So these, if anybody has a better way of representing this field of fixing, I'm very, very open to the suggestions. But this is what we have right now. Here, I trace a hierarchy of non-state actors operating with the bureaucracy. These positions that operate within the field of fixing are crucial in getting a file moving within the institutional structure of the development plan. Suresh, the follow-up boy, had been a fixer employed by Builder X for the DP department of the BMC for the last 7 years. He was not only well acquainted with the internal politics of the department, but also privy to the relationships that officials shared with political leaders, business people, and officials of other state agencies. It was his job to make sure that a file containing requests for developing a piece of land would move accurately and swiftly in a Byzantine bureaucracy. This meant that he would learn the key skills of how to speak to every bureaucrat that they would encounter, how to offer cash without being offensive or visible, and what they each liked or disliked, or what it would take to get the job done. Suresh started working as a follow-up boy in the field of fixing almost at the same time as Gaikwad, the tracer, started working as a tracer in the DP department. They learned the ropes of the hierarchy of positions of their respective fields together. While Gaikwad had learned not to question his superiors and bow to political pressures when required as per the regularities of the bureaucratic field, Suresh's training had taught him that time was money. Not only was it Suresh's job to show up at the office every day and take account for where the file had moved within the bureaucracy, but it was also his responsibility to remind the officials that his clients were waiting for them to take action. Suresh introduced me to an agent in a similar position as him within the field of fixing, referred to as the paper expert, who, like him, also worked for Builder X. Here, he introduced me to Mona, the paper expert, sitting amid reams of building plans and nondescript files. She was responsible for all the paperwork that was required for the proper construction of a file seeking permissions. When I asked her about what her job was, she said, "मैं कुछ गंदा काम नहीं करती, corruption वगैरह मेरा domain नहीं है, मुझसे मत पूछो. I do not do any of the dirty work. Corruption and all are not my domain. Don't ask me." Mona was neither an architect nor an engineer, just a graduate of commerce who had started working as a secretary of the chief liaisoner in this office about 17 years ago. Under this superior's training, and with her perfectionism, she had excelled in doing paperwork that was required to get the building permissions. मेरा paperwork perfect होता है, इसलिए सब मुझे respect करते हैं, बाकी का काम मैं नहीं देखती. My paperwork is perfect, which is why everyone respects me, but I don't handle the other work of the fixing process, reiterating that she was not a part of the corruption that was endemic in this industry. In addition to showing me the list of documents and paperwork required for development permissions, however, she also showed me a spreadsheet containing the list of officers who were to receive particular gifts from the developer for the upcoming festival of Diwali. She was responsible for nurturing the very tenuous relationships, the social life of the file between the fixers and the bureaucrats. The paper expert is homologous to the sub-engineer, who is also expected to fulfill the documentary requirements of the permission process. Suresh in the following weeks took me to other bureaucratic spaces in the city, chasing for files that had suddenly become stuck, so I could better understand the field of fixing. Here, almost all the time, Suresh was followed around by this very silent man who never spoke to me. Suresh later explained to me that this man was Ratnakar, a watcher. The role of the watcher is to watch who comes to the office, when and why, to know who is in a meeting with whom. He observes whether an officer has come into the office, if there is anyone at his desk, and whom the officer talks to at different intervals in the day. The moment the officer who is handling the file of the concerned team is free, the watcher would make a phone call to the follow-up boy who would appear at the desk of the officer ready to begin his transaction. The watcher's task is so tedious that sometimes they can go weeks or even days just waiting for the officers to deciding to sign a particular document. If these arrangements don't exist, situations in which various files are tampered with, altered, or even disappeared after being rejected can very easily arise. Suresh also worked very closely with what I'm describing as a regulation expert. While Suresh's job would often involve waiting, fulfilling demands, and following up, the regulation expert was directly overseeing Suresh's activities and would argue for concessions that each file demanded. Every time a scrutinizing officer would raise a problem with the file in question, he would be ready with his interpretation of the loopholes in the regulations to solve it. Of course, showing up every day at the head office and fulfilling their every whim was a part of his job, but the most important part was that they understood and interpreted the bureaucratic regulations in a way that was most beneficial to their client. These regulation experts are like lawyers who roam the halls of the DP department, often with more considerable expertise in the regulations than the presiding officers themselves. According to official policy, bureaucrats are supposed to be transferred from their plum posts of the DP department every 3 years, while these fixers often stay with the file from its conception to its implementation, spanning several years and making them indisputable experts. It is also the job of the regulation expert to be appraised of the various changes to the regulation. And the notion of arguing for concessions on the regulations is so inherent that one assistant engineer, who is placed similarly to the regulation expert within the bureaucratic field, once told me, "The need for liaisoning or fixing is never going to go away. When people put in their petitions, they will try and maximize their profit in any possible way. It is our job to identify the many ways in which they are trying to circumnavigate the system and demand explanations for it. If these guys can give me a legitimate explanation for why they are asking for this concession, why should I not give it?" So moving on, we have the regulation strategy expert or the strategy expert who I've introduced to you before, Khandekar. Khandekar could, with great ease, traverse between the different locations of the DP office, working through getting the high-level approvals, so like the final approvals for occupancy and other high-level approvals. He was fluent in Marathi, Gujarati, and Hindi, the operating languages of the market players that he attended to. I learned that he had worked in the bureaucracy as a bureaucrat himself for over 22 years and had even advanced to an elevated rank. Khandekar was a particularly powerful agent in the field of fixing because he was a high-ranking office bearer in the engineers' union formed by the Shiv Sena, the ruling party in the BMC. This meant that whenever an officer wanted a lucrative transfer or was facing any difficulty with his service within the bureaucracy, he would turn to Khandekar for help. In his position, homologous to that of a high-ranking officer in the bureaucratic field, due to the great informational capital that he held, Khandekar could easily be considered a dominant actor within the field of fixing. In tow with Khandekar, I visited the offices of the Liaisoning Architect, located in a residential complex hidden away in a nondescript part of the city. He introduced me to Mr. Ramakant, who, like Khandekar, was an ex-BMC officer specializing in the operation of the land and building bureaucracy. Ramakant had decided that getting out of the bureaucracy and into the business of getting approvals would be more lucrative for him after a stint of 24 years in public service. This job, according to Ramakant, involved two things. The first is to add value to the project, and the second is to get the plan approved. Any regular liaisoning architect, according to Ramakant, would be able to get the files moving in the bureaucracy by mobilizing various relations or greasing the wheels of the machinery with money. However, to add value to a project, he was convinced it would take a set of skills that required the ability to read and manipulate the regulations that were not easily accessible to those who had not been inside the machinery like him. Ramakant assured me, जितना complication होता है regulation में, उतना हमारा value बढ़ता है. सबको नहीं समझ में आता है ये सब. The more complex the regulation, the more valuable our insights become, as no one else can interpret them. Even the international players coming into the city must go through Ramakant. बाहर के लोगों को हमारे यहाँ के तरीके नहीं समझ में आते हैं. वो हमें concept भेज देते हैं और हम उनको reality बना देते हैं. People from outside the country don't understand our ways, and they send us the concept, and we make those concepts into reality. This was evidenced in the large number of international clients that he had entertained regularly, and who often lack the social and the cultural capital and district-level contacts needed to bribe officials to buy land, change land use codes, and obtain permits, as Irina Searle has written about. Though by no means exhaustive, this illustration of the field of fixing shows us how it is an arena of struggle. Each of the positions that I highlight here have their own function and must operate by the rules of the game that is decided by the dominant players of the field. The dispositions of each of these fixers is learned through being a part of the game and putting in the time learning its rules. This field of fixing, unlike the illustrations of singular brokers who operate for a small fee within the post-colonial bureaucracies, manage property transactions and channel an estimated 15% of the project costs to bureaucratic players. The real estate market of Mumbai, worth $800 billion, cannot survive without the agents in this field. While this system stays intact, between 2014 and 2017, due to the introduction of the single window clearance system as a part of the doing business reforms for the approval process between the DP and the BP departments, the number of procedures required to get a development permit has reduced from 119 to merely 8. These are official estimates, which are obviously far lower than the real numbers. And the processing time has reduced from more than 400 days to 60 days. And as can be seen in the notice, and in this notice at the BP office, due to the introduction of the software and over a short span of just 3 years, the bureaucracy in Mumbai claims to have become a completely paperless office. However, as Babu Rao's intern at the DP office, I realized that this system was almost exclusively being used by the fixers and liaisoners that I just highlighted. The regulation strategy experts and the liaisoning architects were instrumental in the design of the software itself, even outlining the skeleton for the initial algorithm for the programmers of the software company designing this tool. Next, I further explicate the field of fixing at the ward office of the BMC. Here, I discuss the online complaints platform developed through disjointed efforts between different departments of the BMC and as prompted by institutions such as the World Bank and the Mumbai High Court for recording unauthorized constructions. Additionally, I trace the origin and role of the professional complainant to show the emergence of one key source of hacking, smart urbanism. Okay. In the past, by accessing what Solomon Benjamin has called the porous bureaucracy, the poor built and grew their settlements by mobilizing kinship and other relations of trust stealthily in Mumbai. Kaviraj describes these low-level officials as those having feet of vernacular clay, and as he notes, are typically ones who shared the same vernacular language, caste, and cultural affiliations as the clients that they served, giving them ethico-political commitments to the public even if they violated their official duties as agents of the state. Before the online complaints came into force, the mukadam, a municipal assistant at the lowest level or the lowest level bureaucrat at the ward office, was the primary conduit through which the unauthorized constructions could be recorded. This municipal assistant would eventually, was responsible for reporting unauthorized constructions to the junior engineers and the complaints officers at the ward offices of the BMC. For instance, if someone were adding a floor to their slum tenement or decided to capture a little more land because the number of people increased in their household, it would be up to the mukaddam to either report or ignore these violations. Additionally, it was also their duty to monitor infractions in the construction of real estate developments in their ward.
Could you take just a clarificatory question?
Yes.
The term mukaddam, he is part of your fixing field, or is he part of your official bureaucratic field?
Bureaucratic field.
That term is used by the bureaucracy
Yeah.
for the lowest level official.
Yes.
Historically, the term meant jobber.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
These are people who used to recruit from East India, UP, etc.
Yes.
For
Low-level work, yeah.
Okay.
But there is an official post in the BMC even today, Mukaddam, yeah. And this is actually especially with relation to the land bureaucracy, the Mukaddam is used quite, not just in Bombay, but in other parts of the country as well. Right. Okay, let me just get back to this part, I think. So the images that you see, these are maintenance jockeys where the mukaddams essentially can be reached. And these are the registers in which they would record the various infractions that were brought to them by the people. Okay. In the years after the liberalization of the Indian economy, hiring freezes within the BMC resulted in severe understaffing of the ward offices. In an administrative ward where the required number of mukaddams according to demographic standards would be 15, only 2 would actually be in service. Where each department of the ward office would have in the past would have their own dedicated mukaddam for the various public service needs, solid management and removal of unauthorized construction. Now these mukaddams, the 2 mukaddams, would be responsible for a plethora of functions. Resolving complaints of encroachment or code violations took a back seat as the municipal workers struggled to meet the more immediate public utility work requirements. In this backdrop of severe labor crunches and overburdened staff, the mukaddams and engineers of the bureaucracy started to rely more on political party workers or karyakartas operational within their jurisdictions. The political party workers within neighborhoods allowed for an arrangement between the low-level bureaucrats and the karyakartas for detecting and reporting code violations. At this stage, even after the involvement of the political parties, it was still up to the discretion of the mukaddams to file complaints and inform their superiors. The municipal chowkis were the locations where one could see the dynamics of political society unfold within the bureaucracy. Due to the years of experience accrued within their communities, the mukaddam remained the entry point to a sophisticated mechanism for negotiation spanning the hierarchies of the bureaucracy known as mandwelli. In the past, information about land use violation and building code within the administrative ward would flow from bottom up. The mukaddam would make his entries in the detection registers. The JE would respond to the entries first by bringing them to attention of the superiors and then by issuing a notice of demolition to which the owners of unauthorized constructions would have 30 days to respond. If the informal negotiations between the concerned parties would fail, only then the JE and the mukaddam would oversee the demolition of the aberrant structures. The sub-engineer, typically in addition to overseeing the demolition of unauthorized structures, also issues certain ward-level approvals for building construction. In addition to managing the processes mentioned above, the assistant engineer is required to fulfill the elected municipal councillors' requests within the ward. Finally, the Assistant Municipal Commissioner or the ward officer has broader powers overseeing the implementation of most functions within the bureaucracy. However, as the ward officer himself has once pointed out to me, that the higher echelons of the bureaucracy would often have no knowledge or control over the ground reality of these administrative wards. Almost analogous to these actors within the walls of the ward offices, I trace a hierarchy of actors operating within the domains of the paralegal, responding to the requirements of the political society. As can be seen in these diagrams, Karyakartas are essential in helping JEs as they navigate the contentious spaces during demolition. So as can be seen, informants are analogous to mukadams that feed them the necessary information required to detect unauthorized construction. Karyakartas are essential in helping JEs as they navigate the contentious spaces during the demolition. The Shakha Pramukh, or the head of the political party in a particular area, works with the SEs to monitor construction projects and public works initiated within the department and within the ward. The municipal councillors and the AEs must work together to oversee the distribution of the development funds. And finally, the members of the Legislative Assembly bring concerns such as problems in the implementation of large infrastructure projects to the attention of the ward officer. This process of negotiation and concession making has been altered with the transition to digital technology. So during my field work within the ward office, the JE, Miss T, once told me, those low-level people, the mukadam, had a lot of power when they controlled the paper registers. They were the ones who were lodging complaints, often not writing them down, and who had made the complaint or why. She said, in this new digital phase, this low-level bureaucrat has been completely replaced by ethically ambiguous fixers who work for political parties within neighborhoods and typically truck in violence, threat, or pure graft more than the mukaddams had ever done. After the introduction of the online complaints platform, the informants that previously would provide information to the mukaddams have taken on the mantle of what is commonly termed as professional complainants in the bureaucracy. Directed by the Karyakartas, these informant-turned professional complainants now do not need to rely on low-level bureaucrats to earn their keep. Instead, they have reconfigured mandwelli, the system of negotiation that I described before, to serve their own ends. Earlier, when the bureaucracy used paper registers to file complaints, the mukaddams would do so at their own discretion without officially requiring the complainant's identity and exerted their moral authority in the process. The new online system, on the other hand, does not register the complaints without the identity of the complainant. This simple provision of requiring identification from the complainant is meant to prevent individuals who are not directly impacted by the source of nuisance from filing multiple complaints. However, the complaints officer of the M East Ward eventually explained the redundancy of the stipulation to me. She said, these days, the only people filing the complaints against unauthorized constructions are those who have political connections. When a complainant is against some builder violating the building code, the complainant is almost always in cahoots with the engineers handling the files. When it is about some slum tenement, it is for sure someone linked to a political party in power in that particular ward. So it doesn't really matter who you are as long as you have the right links within the bureaucracy. By this, she was pointing towards the political and social capital required to not just register a complaint, but to carry it through. This also meant that both within formal and informal neighborhoods, as can be seen here, the reporting and handling of complaints had moved out of the ambit of the ethical and moral inclinations of lower-level bureaucratic staff. Okay, and even the ward officers once told me that the online system is not very different from the paper registers that were used before. The processes are the same, but the poor mukaddams have stopped making money. So essentially, the 4 registers that were used to file the complaints before remain the same even on the online system. Such an arrangement between the fixers and the mid-level bureaucrats and politicians across the ward offices in Mumbai can be mobilized in case of new construction, additions, and alterations to buildings as well. Mandwelli was so widespread during my fieldwork in the ward offices that out of the 200-odd notices of demolition that were issued in October 2017, only 183 remained pending for, about 183. Out of the 200, about 183 remained pending for action till mid-year of 2018. Instead of addressing the complex systems of negotiation at the root of what reformers perceive to be corrupt practices of the bureaucracy, the online complaints platform merely replicated the existing paper technologies. The 4 paper registers recording each step of the demolition procedure was merely transposed onto the online platform. There was no effort to address the complexities of the patronage politics at the neighborhood level or the importance of maintaining the discretion of mukadams in the system. Perversely, the technology has simultaneously rooted out the low-level bureaucrats who were instrumental in mobilizing the resources for the poor, and instead of approaching the familiar mukadam in their neighborhoods, people must now go to the karyakartas or political party to get their grievances addressed. In a twist of fate, digitization has taken power away from a low-level bureaucrat and placed it in the hands of a non-state agent, the fixer. Instead of depoliticizing the process of lodging online complaints, they have placed it squarely in the domain of political society. To conclude, I will recapitulate my argument over here. I argue that fixing is the structural principle of the post-colony. It is the dialectical other that compulsorily accompanies governance or governmentality. It is a glue that is sometimes made of kinship or caste, and sometimes simply of the skill of managing people and knowing what they want. Thus, while the organizing principle in the post-colony may be that of caste and class-based segregation with its particular colonial heritage, fixing is what holds this together and which transforms it through practice. As a structural principle, it may at times seem pro-people and pro-poor, and on other occasions, fixing appears as a principle maintaining the status quo that is the post-colony itself. More often, fixing is the practical means by which the circulation of capital in the urban landscape is maintained and reproduced. In this sense, my work shows that fixing is the historical and social a priori without which the post-colony does not exist. And it is here where one must look for a politics that suits the times that we live in. Fixers are not struggling peasants or subaltern figures. They are not seeking revolutionary transformations. They are the agents who maintain a state outside of itself, a shadow state of affairs that makes the shiny World Bank-sponsored exterior of the world-class city, but also ensures slippages that tarnish the city's sheen. Instead of seeing these fixers as nebulous beings, momentarily appearing to mediate between petitioners and the bureaucracy, I trace a structure composed of these agents which itself mediates between the fields of bureaucratic state and various developers of land in Mumbai. I argue that carefully interrogating the rules and regularities of this field of fixing in Mumbai, we begin to decipher the conceit of state power in India and much of the post-colonial world. Thank you.
Thank you, Sangeeta. So the floor is open.
Well, this is a remarkably meticulous ethnography of a system that to most of us, I mean, I have not worked that much in Mumbai, but we have, our team has, and what to most of us seems impenetrable. So you are presenting a slice of a very important slice of Mumbai's life that requires this kind of deeply immersed ethnography. So thank you for enlightening us about this. Right? a few discrete points, not necessarily coherently connected. One, in one of the volumes I edited, I published an article by James Maynard called Fixers in Indian Politics. I wonder, it was a Festschrift it's a memorial volume from my teacher, Myron Wiener, after his death. So James Maynard wrote that essay. It might just be worth looking at what the similarities are. He's not a political ethnographer. He's a mainstream political scientist who does a lot of field work, and documented how from the smaller towns of Karnataka, these fixers were connecting people to powers that be in the city of Bangalore.
So towel over armpit, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Towel over armpit is the title.
Yes.
So
yes.
they have a
Yes.
they have a towel like this, and they get into the buses or the trains and get to Bangalore.
Yes.
And do something for me.
Yes. Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yes.
They are representing towel over armpit. That's right. That was the title.
Yes.
And so anyway, if you recall the argument, tell us how yours is different. That was an urban, rural, or small town Bangalore connection, and you are actually concentrating on one of the biggest urban bureaucracies of India. Okay. Second, I couldn't figure out from the argument why the mukadam lost his ability to manipulate the system. Online, was the mukadam a sort of a, I mean, only, as they say in India, 8th pass or 6th pass, so he couldn't switch to online grammar of work. Why did mukadam lose his power? Third, presumably some people who can be identified either economically or through their reputation, some people are above this system and they don't necessarily need mukaddams, and so the building of Antilla, the tallest home in the world, I don't know what codes it violated or didn't violate, whether you studied that, but any violation of the code or any getting any permissions for someone like him is unlikely to involve a mukaddam or etc. There must be some other way of navigating through the system. Similarly, when Lata Mangeshkar said that this metro cannot be built over Pedder Road because it will do aesthetic or some financial damage to her apartment there on Pedder Road. And she managed to at least delay it, maybe not block it, I think, or whether the subway's path was changed or so. But she's not an Antilla owner, but someone like her also perhaps doesn't need mukaddams. Now, could you tell us about the class of Bombay as such a fine-grained student of this bureaucracy? What class of Bombay or what kind of people Bombay would not require this bureaucracy at all and can operate without it? So those are the three things.
Okay.
Yeah, if I have something else, I'll come back.
Absolutely. Let me start with the last question. Should I collect some more questions, or
Totally up to you.
does anybody else have questions? Yes.
You can go ahead.
Yes.
You do, right? Well, thanks so much, Sangeeta. This is brilliant, and I really like how, usually, at least based on my reading, like notions of fixing have been at the local level, and you scaled it up. So brilliant, thank you again. So I guess two parts to this question. The first is when you talk about, you bring in Solomon Benjamin's occupancy urbanism and talk about the local level, right? You're saying with the introduction of this technology, like you can bypass the mukaddams, and also, I guess my question there is, does this make occupancy urbanism obsolete or just more political in nature? So that's one question, conceptually. And secondly, sort of building on Ashu's point about why did the mukaddams lose power, like, I'm wondering, so there is ideational work going on at the higher levels, right? But in terms of like, at the lower levels, is it just the movement of files? Or were the mukaddams also, was there like some ideational component? And if so, then how did the caricatures like manage to get the information needed to move the files along to get approval? I hope that makes sense. So those are my questions.
Yes. Yes, I'll take it. Yeah, sorry, I'll take your question as well.
This is, really unbelievable great work. I love the kind of conceptualization that you put. I just have a quick clarificatory question.
Could you speak into the microphone?
Oh, sure.
Switch it on, yeah, because it's being streamed.
Yeah, so I was just curious, in those kind of like pyramids that you drew, which was so helpful in terms of just, so this is the kind of equivalent bureaucrat figure, this is the equivalent fixer figure. I was just wondering, if part of what I understand the kind of value of the project, which is immense, is this kind of conceptualization. You mentioned a few times no one's done this before. It's the first time you're building, so it's ethnographic, and then there is an argument, but there's also a huge conceptual contribution to this. And I was wondering if, to kind of bring that contribution out further, if you could tell us a little bit more about that kind of pyramid and the conceptualization that you're putting forward there, of, literally relating every level of a fixer to a bureaucrat. So for instance, I was thinking some of the other dimensions that it would be really useful to be able to kind of just have a little bit, more information about would be just, for instance, the payment structure, right? Like we know how bureaucrats get paid their salaries, but so what are the sources of the kind of payments that these fixers are receiving? Are they from, you mentioned this distinction between the freelance fixer versus the, the fixer that's hired by, so exactly how does that work? Would the salaries of a fixer be comparable to that of a bureaucrat in the same level? What about qualifications? You mentioned expertise, the fact that their experience actually, I thought that was a super interesting point, right? Like the fact that the fixers do this all their lives, the bureaucrats get circulated. So again, so to me, like these kinds of important points that are, I don't know if they're necessarily buried in the text, but because you have so much rich material, I think part of the challenge is to kind of bring out the part that I think would be really conceptually innovative and kind of pushing the envelope. So for me, really trying to understand, what are the kind of structures, the qualifications, really that kind of comparative pyramid, I thought was just super exciting, and I would love to see more, and I can possibly see that as a kind of standalone article, right? And just, on an aside, we've seen these kinds of similar pyramids for instance, party states, right? Like, so in China, you always see this kind of a pyramid that this is how the political party works. And this is how the state works, because it's a party state. And that's a kind of conceptualization, right? We call China a party state. So I was wondering if you wanted to even take it one step further and say that, because the central argument, as I understand it, is that fixing is this kind of structural principle of the post-colony. So if then it is the structural principle of the post-colony, then what do we call that pyramid, right? Because then if I follow your argument, that pyramid is kind of an essential component of bureaucratic functioning. So the argument, for instance, for places like China is that the reason, and Daniel Koss has a book called Where the Party Meets the State. And he makes the argument that, he uses kind of pretty sophisticated GIS methodology to basically argue that it's where the CCP cadres are strongest, and he in turn relates that to the Japanese invasion of China, is that is where the CCP is most effective. So then is it the case that if you're saying this is a structural principle of the post-colony, that it is, like, do we call it that? Like, do we call it the fixer state? Are you willing to go that far? And is it the case that, in a sense, where this, I'm a political scientist, so to some extent I'm also thinking of outcomes, right? So the conceptualization is super exciting, but I'm also wondering, is there a way, and this need not be what your ethnographic necessarily shows, but it could be future research that it gestures towards, right? So is there a way that we could make a similar argument that, if the state is most effective when the state is buttressed by the party at each level, is it also the case that the kind of bureaucracy is kind of, quote, most efficient, and that's obviously a kind of loaded term. Is it most efficient when it has this kind of parallel structure? And so, so those are kind of two related points that to me speak to what in this presentation struck me as the kind of most conceptually innovative kind of, would you, can I look forward to a book that says, it's actually India should not be called the, X state, a flailing state, a post-colonial state, a kind of, but actually it should be called the fixer state, and maybe, that's in a sense the way in which kind of urban bureaucracies function. So I had I'm afraid of going on too long, so I'll stop there, and I know we're having dinner together, so.
Okay, now I'm going to take the questions. I'm going to try and answer each of the questions. And thank you for such brilliant questions. And I must say, I must start with the point that I really did gloss over how the mukadams essentially lost their power because of, in the interest of time. But what essentially happened is that they lost power of the paper, they lost access to the paper technologies. It was not that they didn't know how to operate these, these new platforms or how to lodge complaints, but the fact that the complaints would go directly to a higher up officials. So the kind of pathway of the complaint got circumvented. So as a result, the mukaddam, what usually would come to him first, and then he would decide whether I can make a discretion, etc., to pass it on or let it go, whatever. That authority he lost, and that authority directly went to the complaints officer sitting inside the ward offices. So this is how the kind of thing got, the pathway was altered a little bit.
And the mukaddam could not have access to the ward office?
No.
That was not the way?
No, the power usually, it used to go via JEs. So JEs and mukaddams and sub-engineers would have their own, kind of understanding by which they would or not, pursue a complaint. But now, because the dictate was coming from top down, they had no other alternative but to follow through. And those complaints were usually coming in cahoots with, the political party, Karyakarta, and so the Karyakarta would have his informant. So if anybody does anything in a particular neighborhood, the Karyakarta is informed immediately. And that person, that Karyakarta will immediately go to the person who has encroached or violating the code and tell whether you want to do some sort of mandwelli right now. If they don't do the mandwelli, then a complaint is filed. And even after the complaint is filed, they still can do mandwelli. So it's that the discretionary power of the mukaddam has completely disappeared so far. I wouldn't go as far as to say it's completely disappeared. They do have some political capital in these neighborhoods, but they have been considerably reduced in these neighborhoods. That being said, the class question. So that is why I trace both the top level and the ward level. So in the head office, every building development that happens, it has to go through the DP department. So even Antilla has to have gotten development permissions. So of course, you cannot just build Antilla. It doesn't happen, right? So they have to have all of the regulations, satisfied. They've done a lot of work satisfying those regulations and kind of meeting the different concessions that these guys have argued for. So the Liaisoning Architect that I described, there are 4 licensing firms in Bombay. And I mean, of course, 4 large licensing firms which manage about 70 to 80% of the construction business in Bombay. So one of those licensing firms must have done the kind of like process, like converting, conceptual ideas to reality. So every international architect or developer or builder has to go via these guys to kind of municipalize the building plans. So even people like Lata Mangeshkar and people like, Ambani's, you cannot circumvent the local state. So they don't have to deal with the mukadam, but they do have to deal with the chief engineer. They have to deal with the municipal commissioner. So the slices of the bureaucracy that you're dealing with is different, but you're dealing with them nonetheless. And
This one.
Sorry.
One more. So I assume that they would deal with the chief engineer.
Yes.
These people, right?
Of course.
But do they have, when these people are dealing with this local state, do they have agents who begin with mukaddams or the low-level officials, then get the DP clearances, and then, or do you think this is a phone call from the chief engineer to the lower office?
No.
Clear it. I mean, I want to see how power works.
Yeah. So
How does power interact with this bureaucracy?
So the funny thing is that that goes to what Prerna was also suggesting, that there is specialization in, so there is a specialized fixer who deals with the lower level bureaucrats. There is a specialized fixer who deals with the higher level bureaucrats, right? So, and there is also, to the extent that, to get hydraulic permissions, there is a specialized fixer. To get road permissions, there is a specialized, it's incredible. It's the kind of it is a parallel bureaucracy that has been kind of developed to deal with development permissions in Bombay. And I obviously, as one human, cannot trace this. So I have traced, I've just traced one kind of simple movement of files, and this is highly simplified, highly simplified rendition of what essentially happens.
Does power violate the hierarchical movement of files, or does it not? What does power make possible when it's dealing? How does power distinguish these figures from ordinary citizens or middle class citizens who need to build something?
It's power, money. So if you're talking about power, then it has to be economic capital.
Right.
It's not just you. For instance, look at what happened to Kangana Ranawat, right? Her house, even Shah Rukh Khan, is a powerful figure,
Yes.
but has been subject to, checks and balances put in place by the BMC. So it's not power as much as the economic capital that is accrued in terms of the development costs that are associated with constructing a particular building. So it's different kinds of power, social and cultural power, amount to not much in comparison to the economic power over here. I would argue, okay. But of course, not always the case. So there are exceptions as well. Why did so they were not made completely obsolete? Of course, they serve basic functions, and they still are very much the day-to-day face that people see for drains, drain clearances, stormwater drainage, etc. All of that, they are still very much the conduit through which people get to access the state. But in terms of this kind of or unauthorized construction, the part that would ultimately give them larger political capital has been significantly altered, I would say. Okay, and does that answer your question? What else did you? Sorry. So, as to the kind of salaries and the salary structures and the qualifications and the kind of comparative understanding of how this particular field of fixing essentially operates, I would say that like I said, they channel 15% of the project. Of course, they are very, very dodgy. So asking them about money at this point becomes really, really difficult. But I would say that the people who left the bureaucracy were making significantly more than what they were making in the bureaucracy. So, like, they were working for large real estate developers, such as, Kohinoor, for the Vadhwas and the Rahejas. So they were earning a lot of money, like, to the extent that some of them would very freely talk to me about sending their children to Columbia at full tuition, and, having 3 flats in Bombay, no problem, right? So it was a very different kind of, like, financial status that they had accrued after leaving the bureaucracy. But I mean, honestly, like, I cannot compare, because I don't know how much the bureaucrats are making. And the bureaucrats are also making a lot of money. So that's a little difficult to, like, quantitatively determine. But yes, I do imagine that the state cannot function, at least in Bombay, without these folks, and this kind of, like, structure of liaisoning or, like, fixers that have developed over the various years. And though I have traced this in the land and building bureaucracy, I've seen it in action in other sectors of the bureaucracy as well. Like, I've seen it in health. I've seen it in like the water sector as well, but like the hydraulic department. But I obviously have not been able to trace the entirety of it. So, yes, I need to think through this kind of, like, fixing state argument, and I'm still working on it. So, I really appreciate your comments on that as well.
Good. So we're going to take a second round of questions, but I'm going to start by jumping in and then I'll call another. So how is this different from K Street? So K Street is the infamous street in DC where all the lobbyists are located. And by some estimates, for every member of Congress, there are 4 pharmaceutical industry lobbyists. And they're all lawyers. There's a revolving door. There's a parallel isomorphic structure. And this goes to a bit Prerna's question about what's the theory of the state in here, right? Because I don't want to go down memory lane, right? But 1980s, the neo-Marxist debates, you got structural theory, you got your instrumental capture theory. This is a parallel state. You said yourself, it's the state outside of itself. This is kind of an organizational theory of an alternative non-democratic state. So on the one hand, you have your official state, and it's very bureaucratic, right? That's why you can't just jump to the top. You can't, you can pay some people off, but you do have to do the paperwork, and it's, there's 140,000 employees, and they're all there being really good Weberians, et cetera. But in the meantime, you have this organizational state that's really making stuff happen. They're the ones moving the files. And one reading of this is you're just smoothing, this is a smoothing function, right? That it's kind of inefficient, so you have to create your parallel structure, so you have these liaison firms, and they're specialized in doing what the bureaucrats are doing, but doing it better and more efficiently. Except that it's a hoarding function.
Yeah.
There's 4 firms and 8 property owners. This is state capture through a parallel organizational structure. And so to me, this is K Street.
Yeah.
I mean, we would like to pass gun control. We would like to liberalize the import of expensive medications from Canada. The will of the American people is for all these things. It never goddamn happens because the real state is not Congress and the White House. The real state is K Street. And it's a parallel organizational structure, right? So, maybe it's a fixer state. But so I just want to, your descriptions are brilliant. They're fantastic. What was missing in the first story was the actual effects, right? So there's this parallel bureaucracy, but what is the sum total effect of having this incredibly ornate, sophisticated parallel? The sum total effect is a hoarding function. And the World Bank says, we're for transparency. They love to say we want to reduce the barriers to entry. Well, they just increase the barriers to entry by making it more complicated and putting it online and putting it in the powers of the fixers, right? So, and likewise in the second story, again...
Your heart is bleeding for the mukadams.
Huh?
Your heart is bleeding for the mukadams.
Frontline bureaucracy always, but in the second story, it was the same. I have the same set of questions because I get the mechanisms. Again, the ethnographic detail is brilliant. I want to better understand the effect.
Yeah.
So basically, the power to regulate or to, what's the name of the department for the removal of only the Indian bureaucracy?
Removal of encroachment, RETMS.
Yeah, who else comes up with a department called the removal of encroachment permits or whatever it is? Yeah, there we go. Removal of encroachment, what?
Sorry, removal of encroachment department.
Yeah. So, in the past, what you're suggesting is the frontline bureaucrats exercise some degree of forbearance.
Yeah.
We're not just going to evict people. We're going to negotiate, and we're going to have some conversations and discussions. And we know that in a city like Mumbai, evictions happen. But technically, you could evict 52% of the city like that.
Yeah.
Because it's illegal, right? But it doesn't happen. And this is the forbearance. So what is the effect of shifting this over to political society? So what does political society do with the capacity to punish the informal sector? And what's the function of that? And you could take there were a bunch of hands. So let's Ani
Yes.
and Rehan. Four and others. Yeah, with the masks, I can't always figure out who's who.
So, love your work and how carefully you guys and anything on the bureaucracy is always like you bring it to life. My question is really that, I see sort of this tension between the first part of your presentation and the second, where in one part you're describing how the state gets fixed, and another with this digital kind of online complaint system, it's really kind of almost unsettling that fixed state, right? And these are two very different things, because in one, the kind of one-to-one kind of fixing the fixed layers stay intact in terms of how the plans get implemented, or how approvals get passed through the system and so on. But what you're centralizing is almost where the state wants to take control back in a way, or the bureaucracy wants to take control back in a way, is through not by changing the core function, but by introducing a layer of where you invite complaints, but you do it by skipping a few levels, right? And so I'm just wondering whether you're looking at two different things here, which is that because the complaint system is not the core function of the state.
No.
It's kind of an add-on. So are you then really unsettling that sort of lower level frontline functioning, who you see as an ally in some ways, and sort of a pro poor or pro sort of lower income complainant ally. So I'm just curious as to how you see these two work together, because to me they're two different aspects of bureaucratic functioning in a way.
No, it's very much a core function, I would say. Like the complaints platform, what was essentially introduced as a part of, I'll get to you. So it was essentially introduced as a part of this, World Sanitation Program, like the WSP of the World Bank. But it existed even before it in kind of these detection registers that, they use to monitor the growth and kind of functioning of these various colonies that had been demarcated as these. So regularized slums are called colonies in the ward offices. So they are very much a part of the core function of the building and factory department of the ward offices. So I kind of try to explain the institutional structure of the DP. So at the top level, they make the DP. They make the grand plans, and the kind of land uses are demarcated at the top. Then the kind of the zonal offices, they demarcate, they are giving out the kind of construction permissions. At the ward level, it is basically they are monitoring the kind of adherence or deviation to land uses. So encroachments is very much a core function of the BMC. So because of that, any kind of complaint against an encroachment or an unauthorized construction has to be tended to by the bureaucracy. So it's complaints, this framework or this format of complaining is a new thing, a new phenomenon perhaps, but one that has is targeting a very core function of the BMC. So that being said, the mukadams are, how to kind of like think through this. Like, so the mukadams, like what, like Patrick also is kind of asking about is like, what is the effect of this kind of like, the loss of this forbearance? It is the fact that like we have moved into, a kind of like domain in which Shiv Sena and NCP and Congress are going to ultimately determine who gets to stay put. Right, so it's like one party is kind of going like, so if you need to build one floor, instead of going to the mukaddam, you're going to a political karyakarta to, be allowed to build that particular one floor. So it's like a weird politicization or a weird like, kind of like, votes for, a system that has like occurred, which was not the case when like, like in the past, essentially. I think I'm also like, this is what I have been told. So it can vary in different parts of the city also. That is the very like shocking dimension of it. Did I answer all your questions?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, the only thing I want to say was that the difference between encroachment
Hmm.
and the actual approval of permits and building are two different things, and the complaint system addresses the former, but there isn't a digitization and centralization that you describe in the latter. That's the difference I was getting at.
Okay, no, there is actually, so there are like those high level scams also are very much within the ambit of this kind of complaint system. So actually the Kamla Mills fire case, which I kind of used to talk about the complaint system, is the Kamla Mills fire was a building violation. It happened because, those folks didn't actually, the building and factory people, instead of not just like, they didn't record like a shed that was, had been constructed. Okay, this is getting too technical. I'll talk about this later.
Yeah.
But the hoarding function, right? So what are the effects of this hoarding function that I essentially like talk about? Yeah, so like it's not very different from the K Street situation that we are talking about at all. And that is, that's the point, right? But I want to be able to like talk about that, okay, if we don't like recognize and acknowledge this as a domain that we need to kind of like pay attention to and engage with on its own terms, then nothing is going to happen. Like there is no politics. There is no like possible future of politics in the urban scenario, or like even in India, like I think. So that's what I see, kind of like, I don't know how to like describe this. So that's what I see the possibility of a political future to be. But that's the other thing, like lobbying has been legalized, it's visible, it's been in presence for so long over here, but like nothing has been able, like we've not been able to do anything about it either. So I don't know, not sure. that is we need to think about.
So
yes.
we have 6 minutes, and there's quite a few hands, so I want to make sure we...
Okay,
No?
till 4.
Oh, wait, till 4?
And after that, samosa, man.
We have samosas. Okay. Yes, Rehan.
Thanks, Sangeeta. I thought this is, echoing really pushing like architectural understandings of how the bureaucratic state functions in South Asia. But I'm really thinking about the fixers, as you said, as this parallel shadow bureaucracy. But I wanted to actually push back a little bit on, I'm just curious, to me, the idea of like the equivalent being lobbying and K Street is a little bit of a misnomer about how that this shadow parallel bureaucracy, in some ways, what I got out of is really sort of integral to the way bureaucratic functions at every level, all the way from the mukadam up to the higher echelons of the municipal bureaucracy. But given that, towards the end of the presentation, you made 2 points, that this kind of shadow parallel bureaucracy can be both used to maintain the status quo and to be pro-poor. And so I was wondering if you can, like, especially on the how the shadow parallel can be pro-poor. I can understand, like, I think all of us who dealt with whatever level of bureaucracy in South Asia has encountered with fixer. But apart from, but especially on this issue of land tenure or getting permits, how can we think of the fixer as being pro-poor, like apart from loan, quote-unquote, loan ke chote kaam karo? It seems that structurally, though, overall, the system, including the shadow parallel bureaucracy, is really working to exclude the poor, apart from the small in-reaches into the bureaucratic state.
Yeah.
Is that the way you think about it?
So I was thinking about this. I was quite pessimistic about this kind of like, field of fixing before I even like likened to like the kind of like the shadow world in, Stranger Things at one point. It was like that kind of like dark, evil place. But when the pandemic hit the city, right, it was fundamentally through the various actors at the lower levels, that, the resources were actually being distributed. The ward officers were able to organize their, communities in their neighborhoods because they had such intrinsic kind of like, connections within these communities. So, and when push came to shove, like, it wasn't as bad as it could have been, essentially. So I don't know. I mean, I honestly, we need to be able to prod this further, and like we need to actually think through like what the possibility of politics over here is. But I'm quite undecided about its possibility yet, I would say. So pro-poor, in the past, like the mukadam and the informants did work very much in coalition, but it is only after the introduction of these centralizing digital technologies that it has moved, against the favor of this kind of like pro-poor networks, right? So it's worth thinking about, and I don't have an answer to it as of yet, but I want to like think about it more in the future. Zena.
Thank you for this. This is absolutely amazing. It's really wonderful to get like a whole sense of the project and all of the different pieces, and you've done such a wonderful job of sort of laying it out so schematically. I'm sure the bureaucrats would appreciate this if you shared it.
I hate this schematic.
But, okay, so I think the ethnography is absolutely amazing, and my questions are sort of are going to push you to hopefully connect some of the ethnographic detail and brilliance to anthropological questions that I think are already sort of embedded within this, right? Because, of course, you start with Bourdieu. And so my question is, other people who are in sort of thinking about bureaucracy probably have the same problem, where there's this analytical separation that you would try to do, and then there's a slip that happens, which is about how the fixers are integral to the bureaucracy, but they are outside of the bureaucracy, but they are integral to the bureaucracy. So there's this sort of, and I understand that that's an analytical frame that is really essential to the argument. But I guess part of what I'm trying to think about is if we take that into thinking about what sort of what kind of emergent social form is this, and how is it actually relying on existing connections and relations between the state and society. Now the problem here again is, as you'll have noticed, I said state and society, whereas in fact they are integrated, right? And so there's an analytical piece to this about how you actually lay that argument out. But on the face of it, yes, fixers are outside, but as you've shown, they're inside. So how do you actually tell us a different story about the way that these two function together? The other answer to this could be an empirical one, which I think is about, is there a time that we can imagine the state, and I include the colonial state in this, without this element of fixing and brokerage? And so you're referring to this as the post-colony, now moving into the second part of the question, where I think calling it the post-colonial and the post-colonial refers to both a continuity and a shift that ostensibly happened. The difficulty with that is, of course, we've seen that the colonial state itself relied on intermediaries and representatives in a really essential way to carry out these functions. So are you telling us a story of continuity, or is there something different that is happening in this situation that tells us about the post-colonial state in particular that is different? I'll stop there and then we can continue.
Yes, I will reserve this answer for later. But I would only say that, yes, I do definitely see like a continuity. But for that, I'd actually have to like, do a lot of archival research, which I haven't done, as you know. So that is something that I am like in my future work, I do intend to do. Like, what are the kind of like differences between the way in which the intermediaries worked in the colonial setup with the ones that are operating right now? I would only say that they were very much intermediaries back then, but here the kind of analytic that I'm like trying to think about is one in which the state power itself is located in this kind of field of fixing. So I'm not sure how to kind of like think through, but yes, we will think through this together at later points. Sorry, Eva.
Yeah, it's kind of related to that. I was curious more about how static or dynamic are these structures of fixers. Like, how do they get modified? Like, is it, how are they reproduced in other functions of the state, or they're not? Like, what's the movement of fixers within this different functions of the state? Like, is there anyone who challenges these fixers, So like more about the dynamism of the structures and how they get reproduced, like it ties to the past, but into the future and other spheres.
I guess I had a question about like what the agency of the fixers is and how it differs between the approvals process and the complaints process, because it feels like there's a lot more agency with the political कार्यकर्ताs where they can push their own agenda. But the way I understood it is within the approvals of new buildings process, the fixers are kind of just working for their clients. So I'm wondering how much agency they have within that, and also how it differs at the different levels of your pyramid. And to the comparable salaries point, I think it made sense for the architects. It should be making a lot more at that stage. But I was wondering about the watcher, the follow-up person, and the paper expert. And so I'm wondering about their agency, how much they would make in comparison, and also like how dynamic is their role? Like, is it that they work for like one project at a time, or are fixers kind of handling multiple projects at a time for the same client, or are they working for multiple clients at the same time? Just I guess like also like how many fixers are there at each level, because there are 4 architects, but I can imagine there are a lot more watchers for each different development that Raija does.
There are 4 firms, but there are multiple architects in them, and the licensing architects are not architects. They are licensed surveyors, they are structural engineers, they are civil engineers, but they're never they don't have any architectural training. And of course, they, as firms, they manage multiple projects, and they are, they have multiple people in their employ to kind of see that through. That being said, the kind of agency that they engender is the fact that without them, international capital cannot find a footing in the city of Bombay. So they are very, very much required for, all sorts of economic development in the city of Bombay. So the Karyakartas, while they kind of serve larger political interests, these are folks who are serving economic interests as well. So it's also all a combination. So if I conveyed that, the large licensing firms don't have any political connections, that is a great, slippage on my part, because all of these are intrinsically connected to large political parties. So BJP has their own licensing architect, Shiv Sena has their own licensing. So it's a complex political terrain that I'm trying to describe, and not one that is, devoid of politics at any level, essentially. Wait, Eva. So what kind of emergent social, you were also asking a very similar question to that, right? Did I answer your question by any chance, or is there any more clarification? Sorry, I'm just yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, tell, ask.
I was just wanted to go back to the question of how can the fixers be pro-poor. I was wondering if a parallel between the arthiyas in North India, the agricultural markets, is one that is more useful to think about than, like Patrick was mentioning K Street as a comparison point, but do you think the arthiyas are probably like a more relevant comparison group to think about how middlemen can be pro-poor and foster economic development? Like
Arthiyas, I'm sorry.
The middlemen in the mandis in
okay.
Punjab, Haryana.
Okay.
And basically how those middlemen address a market failure. So I'm wondering if it's useful to think of what is a market failure here, and how do you help the poor, how do the fixers help the poor by addressing that particular market failure?
Thank you for that. I will look at that as well. But there are particular middlemen in Andhra, known as pervikars, who have historically helped the illiterate, quote unquote, populations of rural areas to translate and understand land laws while petitioning to the bureaucracies. So in history, it does exist, right? And they are very significant actors, but I've just not done that work. So it's my future project. In the future, I will be doing that, yes. Which goes back to James Manner also, who's one of the very important folks. Done.
Patrick, next round begins.
Okay.
There is an elephant in the room.
Yes.
We need to recognize it.
Yes.
It's politics.
Yes.
And let me suggest in what ways it picks up a lot of what's going on here. There's absolutely no way 52% of Bombay can live in slums, and those slums will not be demolished unless those poor people don't have the vote. And they have the demography on their side. There's a lot of people. A majority of Bombay lives in slums, and they have the vote. Right? Therefore, if any fixer who is politically ambitious, not any fixer per se, any fixer who's politically ambitious, who either wants to connect with politicians or who wants to rise in politics, and we've met quite a few of these in our research careers, would think about that. Right? If the poor did not have the vote, this would not happen. I have been to demolished slums in Pudong, in across the river from Shanghai, and the poor did not have the vote. As soon as slums came, they would be demolished. There are no slums in China, right? In a manner of speaking, they do appear and they disappear, right? Because the connection between the poor and the vote is one way to begin to answer the conditions under which fixers could be pro-poor. Also note that the constituency service literature that has emerged in political science in the last 5 years, in particular, it was there in America in the 1970s, but it has emerged. Jennifer Bassell, Auerbach, Tachil, they're all telling you that people in the slums are those who are trying to connect slum dwellers to the state. A lot of them are doing constituency service.
Yeah.
Regardless of, regardless of the color of the skin, the religion of the person, the caste, they're doing constituency service. Regardless of class, they're doing constituency service.
Yeah.
So that begins to actually push back against your claim or then pushback. I think it'll require some modification in your central claim that the fixer, that fixing is the structural principle of the post-colony. Either fixing will have to take two forms. One, fixing in the form of constituency service or serving the poor as well, or fixing only serving the rich or the or the better endowed than the poor. Right? So fixing will take two forms, given the role politics would play. Right? Now, one more thing that would push back against this idea, that's a structural principle of the post-colony. We've worked in cities where fixers don't have much of a role to play. Kochi, I refer you to Kochi. Believe me, try this out. It is pretty unbelievable how Kochi's local state works. Right? You can say Kerala is exceptional, Kochi is exceptional, you can say all that. And it may well be true that this is not on the trend line, it's a complete outlier, right? But fixers are not to be found there. Fixers are not to be found in the city of Kochi, and I think Trivandrum. Though Trivandrum, I haven't researched as much as we've researched Kochi, right? So I think the claim that it's a structural principle of the post-colony.
But then Kochi has Kudumbashri.
Say it again?
Kochi has Kudumbashri. So like, as an actor who serves the intermediary function to kind of like, make the access available. So it takes a different form.
But it's constituency service.
Yes.
It's not captured by a group, a relatively better endowed group. This is what I'm saying. Once you bring politics in, this particular formulation will need some modification. Right?
Yeah.
And one final political sciencey question for you.
Yeah.
Does it matter? I think you've constructed two Weberian parallelisms for us.
Yeah.
There is a sense in which the bureaucracy is very Weberian. There's rules and etc. And you can only go from below to the top, etc. Right?
Yeah.
Similarly, you constructing the other pyramid, which has the same character, where the middle tier talks to the middle tier of bureaucracy, top tier talks to the top tier of bureaucracy. It's very clearly defined rules.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, the question is for this Weberian type conceptualization. And this is based on, of course, a lot of what has been written about Bombay. What if I'm a Muslim? Will this Weberian bureaucracy deal with me differently? Shabana Azmi says she can't get a house. She may be lying.
No.
She says she can't get a house. She has made that public claim.
Yeah.
Now, Shabana Azmi is no small Muslim. Shabana Azmi is a public figure. If Shabana Azmi, and they're rich, if Shabana Azmi and Javed Akhtar can't easily get a house, then this whole question of the Muslim versus the bureaucracy has to be answered, I think.
Yes. Yes. Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I think the parallelism is because I think it's so appealing, right? That's what makes it really beautiful. At the same time, but I think part of you've shown us this relationship between these two, so the two parallel bureaucracies speaking to each other. But I think in addition to the politics, there's a question of caste and culture and all of this, and our religion that you're bringing up, that actually also allows us to see how those two parallelisms might be extending outwards into social worlds, social and political worlds, along caste, religious, etc. lines that are in fact also a crucial part of doing the fixing, and that helps break down that sort of binary between state officials and social actors or actors in communities. Does that make sense? So there's this outward motion as well as opposed to just the relationship between the two.
Of course.
That is what enables the entire fixing. And that's outside of the liaisoning architects and the real estate agents.
Yeah. So, like, I mean, I hate the pyramids. I'm going to put it out there, and I want people to, possibly give me some kind of like a different form of representing these, hierarchies. But I wanted to be able to present them as like the Bordiusian fields, right? So they are all interconnected. So it's not just like the bureaucracy and the fixers that I'm talking about, but like they are interconnected with every aspect of like society that we like essentially live in. And so it's important. They are significant in the way in which people are educated, the people in which they access healthcare, they get like, access to, 10-year security. So like it's a bunch of things that like come together to be able to kind of create the figure or the field of fixing. And that relates to the political question. So like it's not just in isolation that we're like looking at the land and building bureaucracy, but it is a larger field of power that we are kind of like, I'm trying to point you towards this one field of power, one field which has not been discussed in the literature so far. And the Muslim question, very interesting, I think. I was working in Bhimnagar, which is, so the settlements that I was working within were majority Bihari migrants and migrants from Eastern UP who were predominantly Muslim, and also the adjoining neighborhood, which is called Chita Camp, which is like a settlement that has been kind of like multiple rounds of displacement that, and is a majority Muslim neighborhood as well, again.
Which neighborhoods are these where you've done mostly, like what you call?
M East, yeah.
M East of what?
M East Ward. So it is.
Yeah, just can you tell me?
Chembur.
Huh?
Chembur. Tis ke piche. So basically, these neighborhoods, however, have voted in Shiv Sena candidates multiple times. Their workers are Shiv Sena. They are Muslim workers, Muslim cadre, who are voting for Shiv Sena based on the promise of development. So I don't know what to make of it. And I mean, Patrick was telling me of Tariq Thachils and Adam Orbasok. I haven't like engaged with it very substantially, but like perhaps there is something to the claim that, it's mostly like development work.
Mostly?
Development work that, like ultimately is driving towards.
Incidentally, one of your 8 company that you listed is also Muslim company. Which this guy must be very rich, but there are very rich Muslims in Bombay.
Yes, yeah, they are.
So but nonetheless, this statement made by people like Shabana Azmi, it's not only them, a lot of other people have said that.
But that doesn't.
A Muslim finds it very hard to buy a house.
But then that doesn't go to say that there is not residential segregation in Bombay. There is like significant residential segregation. Muslims do find it hard to find housing in Bombay. They do not get like apartments for rent, and it's not, and like it is segregated. Like the city of Bombay is deeply, deeply segregated, and like that's not something that we openly talk about. But it is.
Unlike what Ambedkar expected.
Yes.
Ambedkar thought this would not be the issue, right?
Yeah.
The city would level everything, and it's not a site of freedom in that sense.
No. And the riots have reaffirmed that. The 92 riots, 92-93 riots have further deepened those segregations. So, okay, can we have some samosas now?
So, Sangeeta, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Thank you for everyone.
Thank you.